Doing any kind of build right now can be really difficult because you can't really get a GPU. For this build, we were lucky enough to find a donor card so that we could build this budget-conscious system for a friend of a friend. This is the GTX 970 Strix. It's an older card from 6 or 7 years ago, but this card is more than capable of running almost any game 1080p at 60 frames per second, which is more than enough for most gamers. As a matter of fact, if you go back about 6 years ago, 60 frames per second 1080p was pretty much the standard. It's only recently that we've gotten into these high-frequency gaming, pushing 240 FPS and even above 300 FPS. You can build a very budget-conscious system, and the 900 series graphics cards are actually available at a reasonable price. Getting a 900 series card is actually a lot easier than getting a 10 series or higher, because the 900 series isn't really highly sought after for things like mining for cryptocurrency. Today, we're going to be doing a budget-conscious build that's still more than capable of playing any games 1080p 60 frames per second. For this build, we'll be using the Intel Core i5 10600K, which is still a more than capable 6-core 12-thread processor. Now, it is the 10600K. We are, however, for the purposes of keeping this in a reasonable budget range, going to be using a motherboard that doesn't have overclockable features for the 10600K. But for this user, it's about getting the best bang for their buck. And so with the 10600K, which we got for a very reasonable price, this system is going to be an excellent build for gaming. Now for our motherboard, we went with the MSI B460M Pro, and it's the Wi-Fi version. Finding a motherboard that can kind of have all the features that you need and still be within a good price point is a little challenging right now. We've picked out the MSI B460M PRO-VDH Wi-Fi motherboard. This is actually a really good board for its price point, and while it doesn't have a whole bunch of other features that many enthusiasts would be looking for, this motherboard is more than sufficient for the use case for the average user. The key requirements for this build was that we have Wi-Fi to make it accessible for gaming anywhere in the house without having to run network cables, to be able to have a processor that can handle modern gaming, so a 6-core 12-thread processor. For the power supply, we went with a 750-watt Corsair RM750X. This system could be easily powered by between 500 and 600 watts, but we wanted to make sure that this is going to be upgradable going forward, at least from the graphics card standpoint. So this will power up to a 3080. Now this 10600K doesn't come with a cooler, so we decided to go with the Arctic Freezer 34 tower cooler. And I've used these in a couple of builds now and pretty happy with the performance. It will be more than enough to keep this processor cool. For storage, we wanted to obviously take advantage of NVMe, so we went with a Western Digital SN550. This is a 500 gig version, so that'll be for our operating system installation and some of the games libraries. We also have, the friend was kind enough to donate a 500 gigabyte SATA drive as well, which will be used for primarily storage. For the computer case, we went with the MSI MPG GUNGNIR 110R case. This case was selected by the end user, and they particularly like it because it comes with 4 fans already equipped with RGB. There's a built-in RGB controller. It's a pretty basic case for the most part. We'll take a look at it a little bit, but it's just kind of your basic steel case. It's got a nice, very nice see-through panel, and the airflow should be more than sufficient to keep this gaming system nice and cool. So let's get this thing assembled so that we can boot it up, run some benchmarks on it, and see if it can still play modern titles that are available today. Well, we've got it all put together. And you know, while gaming on an older graphics card, like the GTX 970, when playing games like Red Dead Redemption or Battlefield 5, are you going to be running at 60 frames per second on ultra quality? Absolutely not, of course you can't. But the GTX 970 is more than enough to play the majority of games 1080p, 60 frames per second, at the very least at medium settings, and some of the older games will play on high settings just fine. The 10600K processor is still a really great CPU for gaming, and any new gaming PC, even for those who are budget conscious, I would recommend not going anything lower than a 6-core at this stage in the game. A 4-core CPU just doesn't cut it anymore in a lot of high-end games. Of course, we had to run all of the benchmarks. Cinebench R23 performs admirably, and the CPU doesn't get above 65 degrees Celsius using the Arctic Freezer 34 tower cooler. While the 10600K is still plenty for any gamer, the GTX 970 is starting to show its age. But for a budget-conscious builder, the GTX 970 will be a phenomenal upgrade over a system from 12, 13, or even 15 years ago. So someone looking at just playing some older games and even some newer games, but not really playing any of the huge AAA titles like Cyberpunk 2077 or Red Dead Redemption, will be just fine on a GTX 970. With a budget-conscious build like this, when graphics cards do become available, it'll be really easy to swap that 970 out for something a little bit newer. So let's talk a little bit about the MPG MSI GUNGNIR 110R. This case looks phenomenal. It's got a good price point. It comes with 4 ARGB fans. It has its own fan controller, and it also is able to connect with an ARGB header on the motherboard for more control. The design choices are actually kind of nice. The front design is really aesthetic. There's a little bit of a restrictive airflow in the front, but overall, the system temperatures are staying between 30 and 35 Celsius, which is not too bad. The biggest problem with this case is cable management. There's very little space in the back to work with when routing and managing cables, so much so that the power cable for the motherboard actually almost didn't fit through. But that's to be expected with a standard ATX case. That being said, this case is more than capable of housing any of your components. And with a micro ATX motherboard, there's plenty of room to move around. The Arctic Freezer 34 tower cooler keeps the CPU very, very cool. Even using Cinebench R23, it doesn't go over 65 degrees Celsius. The Freezer 34 tower cooler proves that you don't need to break the bank to get a cooler that can keep your CPU under control. So let's talk for a minute about the MSI B460M VDH Wi-Fi motherboard. This motherboard is a B460 chipset supporting the LGA 1200 socket. Now, this motherboard was very budget conscious. That being said, it still came with one ARGB header and a standard 12 volt RGB header as well. The motherboard came standard with 2 M.2 slots and has both Wi-Fi and Bluetooth. The only thing the motherboard doesn't have is that this case supports one USB-C connection. The motherboard doesn't actually have a USB-C supported header. That being said, for a budget-conscious build, this motherboard is practically perfect, and it does everything that you would ever need it to do. It comes with 4 SATA slots in case you want to add more hard drives later, and 2 M.2 slots. I would have liked to have seen it come with an M.2 heatsink, but running the SN550 from Western Digital, a heatsink isn't really necessary. For the Corsair RM750X power supply, I would have liked to have seen it come with the little black pouch that the RM850X comes with to store all your cables. Instead, it just came with a little plastic bag. But overall, the RM750X is going to be more than enough for this system, supporting upgrades well into the future. The fans that come with the case are a little bit more audible than some more expensive fans, and the fans are actually only DC controlled, not PWM. That being said, this case is a wonderful deal for the fact that it does come with so many fans, and that the design aesthetic is actually quite good for someone looking to get a nice black build. So when you're looking at putting together a budget-conscious build for yourself, keep in mind you don't have to have the best graphics card on the market. You don't have to have the best CPU and motherboard on the market. You can build something like this for a reasonable price, and with an older generation graphics card, tie yourself over until newer graphics cards that perform a little bit better are available regularly in stock and for a good price. The total cost of this system was just over $1,000 Canadian, not including the 500 gigabyte hard drive that was a donor drive and the GTX 970 that was also a donor card. I'm really happy to be able to get this build completed today because it's going to be replacing a very old build that's currently used for gaming, and compared to that build, this will be a very welcome upgrade. So if you've got some older components lying around, older graphics cards, CPUs, motherboards, and even power supplies, consider reaching out to a friend or a community and see if anyone's looking for donor parts to build their first budget-conscious gaming PC. That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. For the case, we went with the MSI GUNGNIR. Gungnir 110R